When I bought my house 10 years ago, before my beard went gray, the first thing I made sure to do was to plant 2 pear trees in the front yard. Well, only after trying in vain to clear up the brushy growth overtaking the best corner of the property using the most wildly inadequate tools. I planted them just so that today I would be able to quote you the wisest proverb of them all. The best time to plant a fruit tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is now. I haven't harvested any meaningful amount of pears yet. That was partially my fault since it was only after 4 years of neglect while I fixed the inside of the house that I finally decided to rescue those poor pear trees from the perpetual shade of weedy behemoths that had since doubled in size. This is the sunniest area. It's the south-facing aspect of the house. There are way too many trees still here. I need to cut them. I'm gonna try to cut them slowly. The thing is, I chose to buy this house precisely because it sat on a sunny hill. That would be the perfect site to develop my dream garden. I had no clue what that dream would look like, but one thing I knew, dream gardens need sun, so the trees had to go. If anything, gardening has a way of teaching us patience and persistence. Cutting that tree with only hand tools pushed me to the brink of exertion, but I felt proud of single-handedly felling a giant. That feeling of pride turned out to be in vain. A couple weeks later, I was informed by the power company they were scheduled to cut down the rest of the weedy trees on the front bank since they posed a risk to the overhead lines. The Captain Planet side of my brain wept, and the gardener side rejoiced. At first, my plan was to transform this front bank into a bountiful food forest. I had enthusiastically read about this concept as a teenager and had it at the back of my mind since. The idea was to plant fruits and vegetables in layers resembling the structure of a forest, a bit like a Garden of Eden. I had already planted the top canopy layer with the pear trees. Now I needed to fill in the mid, understory, and vining layers with other edible plants, just as you see in a real forest. The goal is to produce a wide variety of food in a small spot by maximizing garden space. Sounds nice and all, but I had 2 main skeptical questions. Would it really work? And most importantly, does it look nice? I wasn't confident on the last one. As I waited for the power company to do the ravishing, I shifted my attention to the sunniest side that was already clear. Unsure how ugly the food forest would turn out, especially for a front yard, I decided to camouflage it with a bit of color. This was supposed to be my dream garden after all, so a bit of visual flair wouldn't hurt.
6 years later, this would turn out to be quite the understatement. But we are getting ahead of ourselves.
I saw some rose bushes on clearance, and of course I couldn't resist the urge, despite my checkered history with roses here in Maryland. I've chosen the Knockout series for roses. They're the only type of rose I've ventured to plant here in Maryland. I've tried planting other roses, but they just die. Because Maryland is so humid, most roses just get black spot. But the Knockout series is an exception. With these bushes forming a sort of hedge, screening the house a bit from the street, I would eventually have a large mass of salmon flowers to frame the garden and tie the mass of the existing Japanese maple tree. But regardless of their design role there, one thing was certain. This sunny slope with fertile, well-draining soil was destined for a rose to live there, as evidenced by their wonderful growth only a couple months later. You can clearly see that they've been loving it. I hope that this whole area here becomes like a sea of blooms that bloom throughout the whole season. Eventually, the power company cut down the other trees in that front bank that year, gifting me with a nice sunny spot to grow my food forest and allowing those lonely stunted pear trees to finally have a growth spurt. That is when I decided to intervene. I don't want them growing too tall. I think they kind of try to reach up, as is the tendency of trees that are competing for sunlight. Armed with loppers, I sought to prevent those pear trees from growing too tall for their own good, meeting the same fate as their former neighbors. So I'm not going to make that mistake again, and instead I'm going to keep these trees trimmed. They are in semi-dwarf rootstocks, so I'll keep them at around 7 to 9 feet. That should give a nice human-sized height to pick things off of. While my food forest had to be kept on the shorter side, I went ahead trying to find suitable edible plants for the mid-story layer. Every proper Garden of Eden needs a fig tree, so figs were a perfect choice even if my climate wasn't their ideal. I am in zone between 7 and 6. I do have a perfect place to put them in, and it has southern exposure. I did make sure to buy 2 different varieties. Maybe I discovered that one is better than the other. One is the Chicago fig, and the other one is the Olympian fig. I think the Chicago fig is a little bit more hardy than the other one. Even though I paid $10 for each, I think it's worth it because if you go in the store here, a small clamshell of figs is going to be $5, $6, $7 if you can find it. And they're nowhere as good as the ones you actually harvest at home. And it's going to pay for itself in just one harvest several times over. So, well, that's if they actually produce any fruit in the future. Obviously, establishing my food forest would not be without toil. Perennial weedy vines love the spot as much as my proper plants would. So I would have to pierce through this tangled web of roots and vines, but these vines were not altogether bad. They were performing a service of extreme importance here. They were helping to hold up the soil on the slope, preventing erosion and soil loss. I could not simply clear-cut everything without immediately planting something else to hold on to the soil. Indeed, part of the reason I chose to plant the perennial figs and pears was so that their roots would help tie back the soil. As spring arrived, coloring the landscape in shades of bright green, I decided to clear a larger spot from vines and roots to plant out annual vegetables as mid-story and understory layers to my nascent food forest. By this point, I could not say which was the more Herculean task, cutting that tree with the hand tools or clearing these vines and roots with just a shovel and fork. This has got to be one of the best soils I've seen around the property. However, it's one of the worst in terms of the amount of roots that are growing in it and all the vines. I suppose all the soil aggregates have built up because of all the vegetation and the intense biology. However, there's no good way of clearing the ground. If I try to mechanize it and use maybe a stump grinder, it's just going to make the perennial vines distribute themselves all throughout as each little piece becomes a new plant, so that's not viable. So it has to be slow work. It might take me more than a day. I'll have to do this in stages and slowly. After finally reaching bare, fluffy earth, I immediately sowed pole beans and butternut squash as understory and vining layer plants. These plants were traditionally sown alongside corn by Native Americans in a practice known as Three Sisters planting. Much like the concept of a food forest, the corn was the tall layer that provided the scaffolding for the bean vines to climb onto. The beans fixed nitrogen, improving the fertility of the soil for the corn and squash, and the squash shaded the understory, keeping the soil cool and moist and preventing weeds from emerging. For another understory plant that would theoretically cover the ground, I decided to try my luck with watermelon. Let's just say I was never able to grow a single watermelon in my life. I was willing to give it one last try here. I think the best spot I have is right where I cleared the other day. If it can't grow there, it won't grow anywhere. In any case, I bought the Black Diamond variety. It's supposed to be 75 days to harvest, so it's a shorter compared to the large watermelons. If you're lucky in the right place, you just eat watermelon, spit out the seeds, and next thing you know, in a few months you have watermelon. Obviously, I would not try to grow watermelon to be shaded by the other mid-story plants. My plan was to coax the vines to take over the front edge of the bank, where they would enjoy full sun and hopefully keep other weeds at bay by shading them out. A couple days later, I had good news. It's just 5 days later after I sown the beans, and they have already sprouted. Another mid-story vining plant I had ready to include in my food forest was tomatoes. They grow easily in Maryland, and I knew this sunny location would be heaven for them. If everything else failed, if the pears got maggot-laden, if the figs failed to bear, if the beans got eaten by beetles, if the squash wilted overnight, and of course if the watermelon shriveled upon flowering, as it always did, I knew I could count on tomatoes, especially if I did this little hack when planting them. I'm going to plant them sideways as I usually do, so that there is a lot of root development in the stems as adventitious roots start to develop from the stems. It was as if I were laying it onto its tomb, knowing it soon would emerge with new, more vigorous life. But then Terrible thing happened here. All the beans have been eaten. The tops, or most of them, only a few, have their true leaves still standing. That means probably a rabbit is eating it. And they attacked first the tomatoes, and I put some chicken wire cloches over them. I'm gonna have to make more if I wish for any beans to grow here. That's part of the reason why I made my protected beds, but I can't have my whole garden be like that. Clearly, wildlife wanted to move into my food forest. As a resourceful human, I had to reassert my dominance through engineering. Maybe I would not be able to provide any food for my stomach through this experiment after all, but at least I had a visual feast cooking up to the side of the food forest. The roses were clearly keeping their end of the bargain. I know that this whole hedge here will grow huge. It's in the perfect spot. I think the soil is perfect, so all the groundwork was done for it to succeed. And while there are a few bug holes in the leaves here, it most likely will pass without much issue. And because these roses are disease resistant, especially to black spot, I think they're gonna thrive. Not to be outshined by the flashy roses, a couple weeks later, the protected vegetables finally understood they were sitting in prime land and decided to burst into growth. The fig trees unfurled their buds, needing up leaves intent on covering the nakedness of the ground. The tomatoes, beans, and squash vines, seeing their freedom curtailed by the protective cages, contorted as circus performers. Even the odd zinnia flowers I had dotted around as ornament to camouflage this utilitarian food forest parachuted the largest leaves I had ever witnessed in my gardening life. Things were up and up, maybe too up. Whatever had been munching on these vegetables has stopped, so I could probably try to take out the protective cages, but I think I'm going to be battling now against two things. Gravity, because everything's going to want to grow and I need to put supports, and perennial weeds. I'll just have to keep removing all these perennial vines in hopes of winning over this battle. The first gardening lesson I learned the hard way was to keep the soil covered by mulch to prevent even more weeds from sprouting. But that doesn't help when it comes to perennial vines that resprout from any fragment left in the soil. Persistence is the only remedy there. As for the battling of gravity, I decided to embrace the forest aesthetic, reusing the cut branches from the fallen trees to fashion rustic scaffolding for the plants. Some copper wire is all you need to tie the pieces together. At the end, I could not say that this was making the yard more beautiful, at least not in the eye of a typical passerby, but I was committing to the forest wizard / hermit aesthetic. In a true food forest, structures would not be necessary, since the goal is to get other plants to serve this role, but I was improvising here. However, if I wanted my planting to function as a forest, there was one key process I would have to mimic here. It is how forests fertilize themselves. One of the strategies I'm taking this year in this forest garden, I am going to be doing more chop and drop of the weeds that are around here. So obviously I have to be careful with some of the noxious things like poison ivy that are still around here. I'm trying to control it, but the other ones that I know are safe are definitely going to be chopped and dropped to increase fertility. This practice kills 3 birds with 1 stone. I weed out undesirable plants, I mulch the ground to keep new weed seeds from germinating, and I fertilize the plants I want to boost growth. My food forest here is starting to experience exuberant growth. It's just amazing how much difference it makes to have good soil exposure and good soil. I will continue obviously doing chop and drop to keep up the fertility, but just from looking at it, I am expecting to get a lot of growth and hopefully a good harvest. And grow they did. Tomato vines adorned themselves with flowers setting fruit. Beans zoomed up the branches while the squash frantically tented the ground, engulfing anything on its path. As long as I keep adding mulch, I think it will keep growing at this vigor. There's one problem. It's starting to shade the fig, and that's not the point. The point is for the fig to get established here. So I might have to either trim or kind of move some of the vines, although if I trim now, probably tomorrow they're twice as big. That's just the case with squash when it wants to grow. My hope is that it can grow towards the road and take advantage of the full sun and maybe even grow into the wild weedy parts. Likewise, the watermelon vine looked vigorous. I just didn't want to jinx it. For the first time ever in my gardening career, I have watermelon vines that look somewhat promising. That means I do have a fighting chance of getting at least one fruit to develop. I'm not gonna hold my breath. And if it decides to just take over this area here that's very sunny,
it might be just what it needed to prevent some diseases and actually grow fast enough to develop fruit. We'll see.
The reliable tomato vines, on the other hand, were taking full advantage of their climbing structure, even if they needed a bit of help from me.
Look at these tomatoes that are forming. Even though the ground is not very moist, just goes to show how much they love this place and the amount of sun it gets and the soil type.
And of course, the juggernaut squash vine would not allow itself to be outmatched by fruiting tomatoes.
Well, the squash has been growing by leaps and bounds. As you can see, it's growing even towards the shadier side. The front side is wild.
Both the squash and watermelon vines would have to battle for hegemony over the sunny bank. Obviously, I was favoring the watermelon.
For the first time, I have a rather decent looking watermelon vine. It's not as vigorous as the squash, and it's kind of having to compete with the squash. I've been trying to trim some of the larger leaves and pushing the squash over that way. So I'll just let it do its thing. If it wants to grow, it will grow.
A new player I had sown a bit later emerged on the stage, seeking to carve out its domain.
Of all the okra that I've sown, I think this patch here is the one that's looking the best. It's gotten the most sun, and hopefully it's already tall enough for it to tower over the squash vine. In a food forest, plants have to compete, and that's not always a positive, but I'm trying to cram as much in this area to produce, and later on I could even take out more of the weeds that are around to really utilize the space to its potential.
Nature, however, is not a safe space, and soon attacks started to take out weaker contestants. Eggplant seedlings got decimated by flea beetles, nefarious cucumber beetles arrived on the scene to spread disease, and summer turned up the heat and turned off the tap of rain. How would these new conditions shift the balance of power? I was eager to observe.
The okra is looking phenomenal at this point. It finally is starting to have its burst of growth. It's been able to tower over the squash, which might be going towards its demise perhaps. Now that the okra is getting the upper hand, it will grow, and it has already started flowering, so soon enough there'll be pods to pick.
And the towering bean vines, which only a couple weeks prior had finally put out delicate pink flowers, now was awakening, covered by an abundance of purple pods pleading to be picked.
The vine is amazing, and it's producing heavily, and if I keep picking, it will produce more.
I was enjoying the fruits of this experiment, but was this my dream garden? No, not really. Yet, it was helping with a very important step towards that dream.
When you do a food forest, you definitely deal with plant competition, but the good thing is that you really diminish the amount of weeds that you're going to be having in a space. And for me, that's a great strategy because I had lots of perennial weeds, and there are some still that have vined themselves over here. But by shading everything, I start to weaken these perennial weeds. And hopefully by doing this year after year, I can finally manage this spot, which is definitely the most productive one, and I have to take advantage of that. Things are just growing like crazy, and I just have to actually make this space even bigger next year. So this is definitely a prime spot to be growing. I need to expand, I need to make it more manageable, but this has been a beautiful experiment.
Well, beautiful only metaphorically, because at face value, this jumble of plants was anything but. It was not what I envisioned in my mind. If we go back to my 2 skeptical questions on food forests, I think we can answer them based on this year's growth. Did it work? Yeah, it mostly did. Sure, it was a bit early to judge if the pear and fig trees would ultimately be successful, and there were some casualties such as the eggplants and the watermelon.
Wait, it turns out that the watermelon vine wasn't even a watermelon. No wonder it was doing better than I expected.
But I did harvest an abundance of vegetables out of this patch of land without much maintenance. Plants did take advantage of every cubic inch of space, and weeds were suppressed. But did it look nice? No, not really. Not in any meaningful way. And certainly, the zinnias I included to camouflage the planting couldn't do much. The sheer useless beauty of the neighboring roses beckoned me with their siren call. It sang the tune of my dreams. I would not resist.
Let me know if you have had experience growing a food forest and if it actually worked for you. So what happened to the front garden then? Well,
And you're going to find out next time in Suburban Homestead. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you want to support the channel, you can always buy art through my Etsy shop, or you can support the channel through Patreon. And as always, see you next time.